The torches guttered in the night wind as the procession wound through the streets of Rome. The year was 85, after the birth of Christ, the reign of Emperor Domitian, and the month was June, which the Romans considered most auspicious for marriage. Flavia Tertia walked at the center of the procession, her saffron veil covering her face, her hair arranged in 6 braids, bound with white wool in the manner prescribed by tradition, stretching back centuries before her birth. She was 18 years old. In approximately 3 hours, she would understand why her mother had wept while helping her dress that morning. The wedding ceremony itself had been beautiful in its way. The sacrifice of the pig had gone well, the entrails showing favorable omens. The contracts had been signed before witnesses, her father transferring her from his authority to her new husband's with the ancient words that made it legal and binding. She had spoken the phrase that generations of Roman brides had spoken before her. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The words meant she was no longer herself. She belonged to him now, to Gaius Petronius Celsus, a man 23 years her senior, whom she had met exactly 4 times before today. But the ceremony was only the public beginning. What waited at the end of this torchlit procession, in the house she had never entered, in the chamber that had been prepared according to rituals her mother refused to explain. That was where the true wedding would occur. That was where she would discover what it meant to become a Roman wife. The crowd around her sang obscene songs, as tradition demanded. The Fescennine verses were crude and explicit, describing in graphic detail what would happen to her tonight, what her husband would do, what she would be required to accept. Young men in the crowd shouted suggestions that made her face burn beneath the veil. This, too, was tradition. The Romans believed that obscenity at weddings drove away evil spirits through the power of embarrassment and laughter. But Flavia was not laughing. She was counting her steps, marking the distance between herself and whatever waited in that house, trying to slow her breathing, trying to remember her mother's final words that morning. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you, do not resist. Resistance only makes it worse. They reached the house of Gaius Petronius Celsus. It was large, befitting his status as a successful merchant who had made his fortune in the grain trade. The doorway was decorated with white wool and branches of greenery. 2 torches burned on either side, marking this as a house where a wedding would be consummated tonight. The crowd grew louder as they approached, the songs more explicit, the shouts more urgent. Someone threw nuts at her, another tradition symbolizing fertility, the shells striking her shoulders and catching in the folds of her dress. Her husband stood in the doorway, waiting. Behind him, she could see figures moving in the lamplight. Too many figures. This was not a private moment. This was not 2 people beginning a life together. There were witnesses waiting inside. There were rituals that required observation. There were things that would happen in front of others that she had believed, until her mother's tears that morning would happen only between husband and wife. Gaius Petronius Celsus smiled at her. It was not a cruel smile. He seemed genuinely pleased, even nervous himself, but his nervousness was the nervousness of a man hoping to perform well before an audience. Her nervousness was something else entirely. It was the nervousness of someone who has been told that something terrible is about to happen but not told exactly what, who has been prepared through hints and silences, and her mother's tear-streaked face for an ordeal whose specific nature remains hidden behind centuries of tradition that no one speaks about directly. They anointed the doorposts with oil and fat. She touched them as required, marking her arrival at her new home. Then Gaius lifted her over the threshold, because tradition said it was bad luck for a bride to stumble entering her husband's house for the first time, and because the gesture symbolized something older, something from an era when brides were carried into their husbands' homes whether they wished to enter or not. The door closed behind her. The singing of the crowd became muffled, and Flavia Tertia finally saw what was waiting in the atrium of her new home. There were 7 people present besides herself and her husband. An elderly woman in the robes of a pronuba, the matron of honor required to oversee the consummation of every proper Roman marriage. A priest of uncertain affiliation, whose presence made no sense until later. 3 female slaves carrying cloths and basins of water and oil, their faces carefully blank in the way of servants who have witnessed things they know they must never acknowledge. An older man, who she would later learn was a physician, his bag of instruments resting at his feet, and standing beside a wooden structure that dominated the corner of the atrium, draped in cloth that hid its exact shape, was a figure carved from dark wood, standing nearly 4 feet tall, with features she could barely discern in the lamplight, but which made her throat constrict when she glimpsed them. The Pronuba stepped forward. She took Flavia's hands in her own. Her grip was firm, almost too firm, as if she expected Flavia to try to pull away. "Welcome to your husband's home," the Pronuba said. "The rites must now be completed. Come. Here is what they never taught you about Roman marriage. You have seen the movies where beautiful women in flowing robes recline on couches while servants bring them grapes and wine. You have read about Roman wedding ceremonies as quaint ancient customs, charming traditions involving saffron veils and iron rings, and verses sung in the streets. You have been told that Rome was a civilization of law and order, of engineering and philosophy, of achievements that shaped the foundations of Western culture. But you have never been told what happened after the wedding procession reached its destination. You have never learned about the rituals that occurred behind closed doors, while the crowd dispersed and the torches burned down. You have never discovered why ancient sources that describe Roman weddings in elaborate detail suddenly become vague and euphemistic when they reach the events of the wedding night itself. Why phrases like "the customary rites were performed," and "she was made a wife according to tradition," appear in texts that otherwise spare no detail about Roman life. Tonight you will learn what those phrases actually meant. You will discover why certain Roman writers declared that the wedding night customs were inherited from an era of barbarism that civilized Romans should have abandoned, but somehow never did. You will understand why the Church Fathers, who converted Rome to Christianity, described pagan wedding practices as abominations requiring immediate abolition. You will learn about the figure that stood in the corner of the atrium, about what brides were required to do with it, about the witnesses who watched to ensure completion, about the examinations that preceded and followed, about the entire systematic process by which Rome transformed women into wives. And you will understand why almost all of this was deliberately erased. Why Christian Rome destroyed texts, smashed statues, and rewrote histories to eliminate evidence of what their ancestors had practiced for over 1,000 years. The rituals were not hidden because they were minor. They were hidden because they were central, and because acknowledging them required acknowledging things about Roman civilization that subsequent generations preferred to forget. If you find these hidden corners of history as disturbing and fascinating as I do, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Comment below telling me where you are listening from. And make certain you watch all the way to the end, because the final ritual I am going to describe, the one that occurred at dawn after everything else was completed, has only recently been reconstructed from fragments that survived the systematic destruction. When you hear what it involved, you will understand why the Church worked so hard to ensure no one ever learned the truth. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Let me explain how Roman marriage actually worked, what it meant legally and socially and religiously, and why the wedding night rituals were not aberrations but logical consequences of how Romans understood women, property, and the transfer of both from one man to another. Roman marriage was not primarily about love. This seems obvious when stated directly, but its implications are profound and extend into every aspect of how weddings were conducted. Marriage in Rome was a legal and economic transaction in which a woman was transferred from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. The Latin term was conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand, and it meant exactly what it sounds like. A bride became her husband's property in the most literal sense Roman law could articulate. Before the late Republic, This transfer was absolute. A husband had the same legal authority over his wife that he had over his slaves and his children, including technically the right of life and death. By the imperial period, when Flavia Tertia walked that torchlit procession, the law had softened somewhat. Women retained some property rights. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances. But the fundamental concept remained. Marriage was a transfer of ownership, and like all transfers of ownership, it required verification, ritual, and witness. Consider how the Romans handled other significant property transfers. When a farm was sold, witnesses observed the transaction. The property was inspected to verify it matched the seller's description. Rituals were performed to invoke the gods' blessing on the transfer and to ensure that no fraud was occurring. Boundaries were walked, documents were signed, and everyone involved understood exactly what was being exchanged. The Romans applied this same logic to marriage. The bride was property being transferred. Her value lay primarily in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs, children who would be indisputably the sons and daughters of her husband, and therefore entitled to inherit his property and continue his family line. This meant her physical capacity for reproduction required verification. Her status as a virgin, never before belonging to another man's line, required confirmation. And the actual transfer of her reproductive capacity from potential to active required witnessing, because a marriage not consummated was no marriage at all in Roman law. This is not interpretation or speculation. Roman legal texts are explicit about these requirements. A marriage was not complete until consummated. The consummation had to be verified by witnesses, because otherwise how could anyone be certain it had occurred? The bride's virginity had to be confirmed, because otherwise how could the husband be certain that any children she bore were his? Each of these requirements generated corresponding rituals that were practiced for over 1,000 years. Rituals that made perfect sense within Roman logic, and that horrify modern sensibilities, precisely because that logic is so alien to how we understand marriage today. Let me tell you about the pronuba, because she is central to understanding what happened in that atrium and in the bedchamber that followed. The pronuba was a married woman of good reputation whose role was to oversee the transition of the bride from virgin to wife. Her presence was mandatory at respectable Roman weddings. She led the bride in certain rituals. She gave advice and instruction, and most importantly, she witnessed the consummation to verify that it had properly occurred. The sources are deliberately vague about exactly what this witnessing entailed. The physician and poet Soranus, writing in the 2nd century, refers to the pronuba's duty to observe the completion of marital duties. The agricultural writer Columella, in an unexpected digression in his treatise on farming, mentions that the pronuba must verify the transfer has been accomplished. Legal texts specify that disputed marriages could be resolved by the pronuba's testimony regarding what she observed on the wedding night. If the pronuba was merely present in the house, while consummation occurred privately in a closed bedchamber, her testimony would be worthless in court. She would be reporting hearsay, saying only that she was told it happened. Roman courts did not accept hearsay testimony in property disputes, and marriage was a property transfer. For her testimony to carry legal weight, the pronuba had to witness directly, which means either the bedchamber was not closed, or the witnessing occurred in a space other than a private chamber. This is where the ancient sources become most frustratingly oblique, using euphemisms and implications rather than direct description. But archaeological evidence fills some of the gaps. Excavations of Roman houses have revealed rooms whose only apparent function was to accommodate observers while something occurred in a designated central space. Wall paintings in Pompeii depict wedding scenes that include multiple witnesses in positions and postures that make sense only if they were watching intimate activity occurring before them. Votive objects left at temples by new brides include thank offerings for surviving their wedding nights, language that seems excessive for a private romantic encounter, but makes sense if the night involved public ordeal. Flavia Tertia was led through the atrium by the pronuba, past the basin of water where she would later be washed, past the slaves who stood ready with cloths and oils, past the physician who would examine her before and after, toward the draped figure standing in the corner. The pronuba guided her hands to the cloth that covered it. Now, the pronuba said, "You must greet Mutunus Tutunus. You must ask his blessing. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia pulled back the cloth and saw what stood beneath. A wooden figure, crudely carved, representing a form she had only seen in the graffiti that covered Roman walls, the form that appeared on amulets mothers tied around their children's necks to ward off evil, the form that stood in gardens as a scarecrow might stand, threatening intruders with its aggressive posture. But this figure was not small like an amulet, or functional like a scarecrow. This figure was sized precisely, deliberately, anatomically, for a specific purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the pronuba explained what Flavia must do. This is the moment where I need to explain something that modern histories of Rome either omit entirely or mention only in embarrassed footnotes. The Romans had a god named Mutunus Tutunus, sometimes called Mutunus Titanus, or associated with the better-known garden deity Priapus. This god was represented as a phallus, and his worship was directly connected to marriage ritual. We know this because multiple ancient sources mention it, always briefly, always with visible discomfort, always rushing past to other topics. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was completing its conquest of Rome, described the practice with outrage. He wrote that Roman brides were required to sit upon the figure of Mutunus Tutunus, that this was considered a sacred duty before consummation with the husband, that the practice was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source writing to condemn paganism, but his description matches fragments from earlier, non-Christian texts that refer to the same practice with considerably less detail but similar basic facts. The church father Lactantius also references the custom, calling it so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier, and with no Christian axe to grind, mentions Mutunus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implies physical contact without explicitly describing it. Arnobius, another Christian writer, provides perhaps the most detailed account, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem, their new husbands looking on. What was the purpose of this ritual? The stated religious purpose was to seek the god's blessing for fertility, to invoke divine assistance for the bride's capacity to bear children. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was likely something else entirely. It was preparation. It was breaking down resistance before the real consummation occurred. It was demonstrating submission before witnesses, proving that the bride would do what she was required to do regardless of her own wishes, conditioning her to accept what would follow. Modern historians who address this ritual at all tend to minimize it, suggesting that the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language used by ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine's word is insire, which means to sit upon or to settle onto. Arnobius uses language implying not just contact but penetration. Lactantius refuses to describe the details because they are too shameful, which would be an odd reaction to someone briefly sitting on a statue's lap. Flavia Tertius stood before the figure of Mutunus Tutunus. The pronuba guided her, positioned her, instructed her in what was required. The witnesses watched, her husband watched. The physician prepared to perform his examination afterward, and Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused. Theoretically, she had that choice. But refusal meant disgrace for her family, nullification of the contracts, return to her father's house as damaged goods that no respectable man would marry. It meant her mother's tears would have been for nothing. It meant everything she had been taught about duty and family and a woman's role in society would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. She did not refuse. This is the point where I need to tell you about the examination, because it was not a single event, but rather a series of assessments that bracketed the wedding night rituals. Understanding the examination helps explain why witnesses were necessary and what exactly they were witnessing. Before any wedding could proceed, a respectable Roman bride underwent examination by a midwife or physician to verify her virginal status. This was not optional for marriages involving significant property. The examination was documented, and the documentation became part of the legal record, establishing the bride's value as a virgin being transferred for the first time. The techniques used were invasive by any standard, involving physical inspection that Roman medical texts describe in clinical detail that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. This pre-wedding examination established a baseline. The bride was confirmed as intact, as never having belonged to another man, as carrying full value in the transaction. The groom's family had a legal right to this verification because they were paying a bride price and agreeing to certain financial obligations in exchange for a woman capable of producing unquestionably legitimate heirs. Then came the wedding itself, the procession, the rituals, and the events of the wedding night. And after those events, another examination occurred. This post-consummation examination verified that the marriage had been completed, that the transfer of the bride from virgin to wife had been accomplished. The same physician or midwife who had examined her before now examined her again, documenting the change in her status. This created a system of verification that was legally robust. If disputes arose later, if the husband's family claimed the bride had not been a virgin, if the bride's family claimed the marriage was never properly consummated, there were documented examinations and witness testimonies to resolve the question. The Romans valued legal precision. They were famously thorough in establishing evidence for every type of transaction. Marriage was no exception. But consider what this system required in practice. The bride was examined by a stranger before her wedding. She was required to perform ritual submission before witnesses. She was examined again afterward. Every step of her transition from father's property to husband's property was observed, verified, and documented. Her body was not her own. Her body was the property being transferred, and like all property transfers, it required inspection. The wedding night itself, the actual consummation with her husband, occurred within this framework of observation and verification. The pronuba was present throughout. Other witnesses might be present, depending on the social status of the families involved, and the importance of verifying the marriage against future legal challenge. The understanding that the night's events would be discussed, documented, and potentially testified about in court shaped everything that happened. Now, let me return to that atrium where Flavia Tertia stood after completing the ritual with the statue of Mutunus Tutunus. The pronuba guided her to the basin of water where slaves waited to wash her. This washing had ritual significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god and preparing her for the encounter with her husband. But it was also practical preparation. The examination would follow, conducted by the physician who had been standing silent throughout, observing, waiting for his role in the proceedings. Flavia was led to a couch positioned in the center of the atrium. This was not the bedchamber. This was the public room of the house, the space where business was conducted, where clients were received, where the household shrine stood with its images of ancestral spirits watching over everything that occurred. She was positioned on the couch by the pronuba. The physician approached. The examination was thorough in ways that Roman medical texts describe with clinical precision. The physician confirmed that the ritual with the statue had been properly completed. He verified that her status was consistent with what the pre-wedding examination had established. He pronounced her prepared for the consummation to follow. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions of these practices is not just their invasiveness, but their casualness. The Romans do not seem to have viewed these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. The procedures existed to protect the interests of the families involved, not to consider the experience of the woman at the center. This is important because it helps explain why the rituals persisted for so long, and why they were eventually erased so thoroughly. They persisted because, within the Roman framework, they made perfect sense. They were logical applications of Roman principles regarding property, verification, and legal documentation to the specific case of marriage. No individual Roman had to be particularly cruel or misogynistic to participate in these rituals. They simply had to accept the premise that marriage was a property transfer requiring proper procedure, and they were erased because once Christianity changed that premise, once marriage became a sacrament rather than a transaction, once women were granted souls equal to men rather than being classified as a form of property, the rituals became not just unnecessary, but monstrous. They revealed something about the foundations of Roman civilization that the Christian world built on those foundations preferred to forget. The systematic destruction of evidence about Roman wedding practices was not incidental to the Christian transformation of Rome. It was essential because the rituals demonstrated what paganism had truly meant in practice. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber that had been prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to tradition, with the marriage bed positioned for optimal view from the doorway, which would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided light sufficient for the pronuba to observe from her position near the door. The slaves who would be needed afterwards stood ready in the corridor. Her husband entered. He had changed from his wedding garments into simpler clothing. He seemed nervous, which surprised her. She had assumed he would be experienced, confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronuba spoke. Her voice was formal, ritualistic, reciting words that had been spoken at thousands of wedding nights before. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion of the transfer. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when she deemed it necessary, ensuring that the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements for verification. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor where slaves waited. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a ritual of verification that had been designed over centuries to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. At dawn, the physician returned for the final examination. This examination confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided her testimony regarding what she had witnessed. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. She would bear 3 children over the next decade. She would manage her husband's household competently. She would attend festivals and ceremonies and fulfill all the duties expected of a matron of her status. And she would never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughter when her daughter's marriage was arranged, because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things were done. It was what being a Roman wife required. The women who came before her had endured it. The women who came after would endure it as well. This was simply what marriage meant. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed or participated in. The rituals were so embedded in the fabric of Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary, like describing how one breathes or walks. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter in whispers and warnings, in tears shed while arranging bridal hair, in euphemisms and implications rather than explicit instruction. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence. That only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence was not conspiracy. It was simply how deeply embedded these practices were in Roman culture. They were the water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing them seemed as pointless as describing water to a fish. But the practices varied across time and social class in ways worth understanding. What I have described so far represents customs among the Roman middle and upper classes during the early imperial period. Families wealthy enough to care about property transfer, but not so exalted that they could ignore tradition. Different rules applied at the extremes of Roman society. Among the poorest Romans, elaborate verification rituals were unnecessary because there was little property to transfer and little reason for legal disputes. Marriages among slaves and freedmen were informal arrangements without the ritual apparatus that surrounded propertied unions. The detailed examination and witness requirements applied primarily to marriages involving significant legal and financial stakes. At the other extreme, among the senatorial aristocracy and the imperial family itself, the rituals could be even more elaborate. When a daughter of a prominent family married, the political implications required absolute certainty about the marriage's validity. More witnesses might be present. More thorough documentation might be prepared. The pronuba might be a woman of particular social standing, whose testimony would carry exceptional weight if ever required. The wedding night became a semi-public event because the semi-public nature protected against future challenge. The imperial family presented special complications. When an emperor's daughter married, the marriage had dynastic implications that affected succession and political stability. The verification requirements for such marriages were accordingly extreme. We have fragmentary evidence suggesting that imperial wedding nights were witnessed by multiple officials whose formal reports were preserved in state archives. The bride was not just becoming a wife, but potentially becoming a mother of future emperors. Nothing about her transition from virgin to wife could be left to private assurance. The Emperor Augustus, who ruled Rome at the birth of the imperial system, was famously concerned with moral reform and the restoration of traditional values. His legislation regarding marriage included provisions strengthening the verification requirements, making it harder to dispute a properly witnessed marriage, and increasing penalties for adultery that might confuse paternity. These laws were presented as moral reform, a return to the virtuous practices of ancient Rome. In practice, they formalized and strengthened the system of control and verification that treated women's bodies as property, requiring careful documentation. By the time Christianity began transforming Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, these practices had been standard for half a millennium or more. Generations of Roman women had experienced their wedding nights as Flavia Tertia experienced hers, observed and examined and documented. The rituals seemed eternal, unchangeable, the way marriage had always been and would always be conducted. Then the Christians arrived and declared it abomination. The Christian transformation of Roman marriage deserves examination because it explains both why the pagan rituals ended and why evidence about them was so thoroughly destroyed. Christianity brought a fundamentally different understanding of marriage, sexuality, and women's spiritual status. These new understandings made the traditional Roman practices not just unnecessary, but intolerable. First, Christianity declared that women had souls equal to men. This seems obvious today, but was revolutionary in the Roman context. If women were fully human, spiritually complete, made in God's image equally with men, then treating them as property to be examined and verified was no longer acceptable. The entire logic of the verification rituals collapsed once you accepted that the bride was a person rather than a possession. Second, Christianity declared marriage a sacrament, a holy mystery reflecting the union of Christ and the Church. A sacrament could not include elements that the Church considered obscene or degrading. The ritual with the statue of Mutunus, the examinations, the witness consummation, all of these were incompatible with marriage as sacred mystery. They had to be eliminated to make room for Christian marriage ritual. Third, Christianity emphasized privacy and modesty regarding intimate matters in ways foreign to Roman tradition. The public and semi-public nature of Roman wedding night rituals was exactly what Christian teaching considered most problematic about pagan sexuality. The Christians wanted consummation to be private, unseen, between husband and wife and God only. The entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive to Christian sensibility. The transition took several centuries and was never entirely complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that elements of the traditional rituals persisted in some areas long after Christianity became the official religion. Rural communities, in particular, seem to have maintained older practices under a thin Christian veneer. But in the cities, among the educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed. The suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of Mutunus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay without being copied. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed or plastered over. The pronuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial, her observation function eliminated. Within a few generations, the detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars who studied the fragmentary surviving sources. The fragments that survive give us glimpses into what was lost. A reference in one text to procedures too shameful to describe. A mention in another of customs inherited from barbaric ancestors. Archaeological findings that only make sense if certain practices occurred. These fragments allow reconstruction, but the reconstruction will always be incomplete. Too much was deliberately destroyed. The Christians did their work thoroughly, and what they could not destroy they buried in euphemism and silence. What survived most clearly was the memory of the statues. Mutunus appears in enough sources that his existence and his role in wedding ritual cannot be denied, only minimized. Modern scholars who address him tend to suggest that the ritual was symbolic, brief, minimally intrusive, but the language of the ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine did not rage against symbolic gestures. Lactantius did not consider brief ceremonies too shameful to name. Whatever happened with those statues was significant enough to outrage Christians who had seen every other form of pagan practice and had developed thick skins for heathen custom. The examination rituals left fewer traces because they were medical rather than religious. Medical practices do not generate the same archaeological evidence as religious ones. No statues of gynecological examination survived to be smashed. No temples were dedicated to verification procedures. These customs left their mark primarily in legal texts that discuss what constitutes valid testimony regarding consummation, and in the medical literature that describes techniques without explaining their applications to wedding ritual. The silence of the women who experience these rituals is the deepest erasure of all. We have almost no testimony from the brides themselves. We do not know how they felt, how they coped, how they understood their experiences. We have only the external evidence of what was done to them, the legal and medical and religious frameworks that surrounded their wedding nights, the fragments that survived destruction, because they were embedded in texts about other matters. What can we say about their experiences based on this external evidence? We can say that the wedding night was not private. We can say it involved examination before and after consummation. We can say it included ritual with religious statues of explicit nature. We can say it was witnessed by at least the pronuba, and often by others. We can say it was documented, and that the documentation could be produced in court if disputes arose. We can say all of this was considered normal, legal, proper, and religiously sanctioned. We can also say that the transition from virgin to wife was understood as a change in property status rather than a personal transformation. The bride entered the ritual belonging to her father and left it belonging to her husband. The verification procedures existed to protect the property interests of both families, not to consider her well-being or her feelings. Her body was the medium through which family alliances were sealed and family lines were continued. What happened to that body on the wedding night was a matter of legal significance, not personal significance. For 1,000 years, this was simply what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to their daughters in whispers that prepared the next generation for what awaited them. The system perpetuated itself because everyone involved accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations that require legal documentation. Women are the medium through which families reproduce themselves. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end of these practices came not from internal Roman reform, but from external religious conquest. Rome did not gradually realize that its wedding customs were problematic and choose to change them. Rome was converted, conquered spiritually by a religion that brought different premises about marriage and sexuality and human dignity. The Christians who transformed Rome did not negotiate with Roman tradition. They declared it abomination and worked systematically to eliminate every trace. They almost succeeded. What we know today about Roman wedding night rituals comes from fragments that escaped destruction, from hostile Christian sources that described in order to condemn, from archaeological evidence that was buried and forgotten and accidentally preserved. The complete picture is lost forever. We can reconstruct outlines and argue about details, but we cannot recover what was so thoroughly erased. And perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of this history. Not just what the Romans did to their brides, but how completely it was hidden afterward. For over 1,500 years, these practices were essentially unknown. Educated people who studied Rome learned about aqueducts and legions and senators, about philosophy and poetry and law, about everything except what happened to women on their wedding nights. The erasure was so complete that most people today have never heard of Mutunus, have never encountered any reference to wedding night examinations, have never suspected that Roman marriage involved anything other than charming ceremonies with saffron veils and scattered nuts. The pattern repeats across history. The aspects of civilization that seem most stable and normal to those living within them are often the aspects that later generations find most disturbing and most in need of hiding. What was taken for granted becomes unspeakable. What was documented becomes destroyed. What was universal becomes unknown. Flavia Tertia died in the year 127 after the birth of Christ, at approximately age 60. She had been a wife for over 40 years. She had raised children and managed a household and participated in the religious and social life expected of a Roman matron. She had witnessed her own daughter's wedding and presumably prepared her daughter for what that wedding would involve, passing along the knowledge her own mother had passed to her. What did she think about her own wedding night in the decades that followed it? Did she remember it with trauma, with acceptance, with something in between? Did she consider an ordeal survived, or simply a duty completed? Did she wish for her daughter something different, or did she accept that this was how things were and would always be? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence that surrounds these practices is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies and their own lives were not considered relevant to the histories and legal texts and medical manuals that men produced. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they thought about what was done, but we know enough to understand why this history was erased. It was erased because it revealed something uncomfortable about the civilization we have inherited. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law, government, and culture. Acknowledging what Rome actually did to its women complicates that inheritance. It suggests that civilization can be simultaneously advanced and brutal, that legal sophistication can coexist with systematic dehumanization, that practices we would consider abusive can be so normalized that they seem unremarkable to those participating in them. The rituals that Flavia Tertia experienced were not aberrations. They were the logical consequences of how Rome understood women, property, and marriage. They were practiced by ordinary people who considered themselves moral and civilized, and who would have been genuinely confused by our horror at what they did. The gap between their perspective and ours is the gap between two fundamentally different understandings of human dignity and what marriage means. When the Christians destroyed evidence of these practices, they were not simply erasing embarrassing history. They were trying to build a new civilization on Roman foundations, while denying what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded well enough that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered nuts replaced the uncomfortable reality of examinations and witnesses and ritual violations. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. And from those fragments, we can reconstruct enough to understand what was hidden and why. We can recognize the patterns of erasure and silence that characterize how civilizations handle their own uncomfortable histories. We can see how what seems normal and necessary in one era becomes unspeakable in the next, how thoroughly evidence can be destroyed, how completely the experiences of millions of people can be lost, because those people were not considered important enough to document. The wedding night rituals of Rome are gone. The statues are smashed. The texts are burned. The customs are forgotten. But the women who experienced them were real. Their bodies were real. What was done to them was real. And we owe it to them to acknowledge what was done, to speak what their world made unspeakable, to remember what their successors tried so hard to make forgotten. For Flavia Tertia, who walked that torchlit procession without knowing what waited at its end. For her mother, who wept while braiding her hair. For her daughter, who she prepared for the same ordeal. For all the generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were rituals of verification and control rather than private unions. For everyone whose experiences were erased because acknowledging them was too uncomfortable for those who came after. They lived, they endured, they were silenced. But we remember. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I have prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you will not want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. I will see you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the dark corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about civilization, power, and the systematic control of women across the ages.